You're listening to Talking Freely, where we discuss culture, politics, and religious freedom. Talking Freely is a podcast from Freedom for Faith, a Christian legal think tank that exists to protect and promote religious freedom in Australia.
Welcome to Talking Freely. My name is Rowan McHugh. My guest today is Dr. Preston Sprinkle, who is president of the Centre for Faith, Sexuality and Gender, and a New York Times bestselling author who's written a dozen books, including People to be Loved, an award-winning book on faith and homosexuality. His latest book is entitled Embodied, Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. Preston, welcome to Talking Freely.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
When people think of the word transgender, they often understand it to mean someone who has had sex reassignment surgery or someone who just feels a certain way. How broadly is the term in use today?
The term transgender is used to describe a wide array of different identities, experiences, and with that diversity, it comes with a vast array of theological or even philosophical assumptions about what it even means. So it's one of the most flexible terms in the broader LGBTQ conversation. And I think that's super important to understand for every Christian to understand right up front, is that when we're talking about the T of LGBT, we're talking about a wide diversity of people. Like, there is no one size fits all of what it means to be trans. And yeah, oftentimes Christians think, somebody who has had a quote unquote sex change operation or sex reassignment surgery, and certainly some people have, but even the whole idea of transitioning comes in various stages. There's social transitioning, there's hormonal transitioning, there's surgical transitioning, and even with surgical transitioning, sometimes there's top surgery, bottom surgery, or both, or there's, so even with the concept of transitioning, some people are along various stages in that spectrum of transitioning. So and some people never transition at all. There's people who identify as trans and have no desire to transition. And so yeah, it's just a wide range of different assumptions when someone says they're trans. So if you've met one trans person, you've met just one trans person, as Mark Yarhouse likes to say.
For the uninitiated, could you take us through how, in our cultural moment, sex has been disconnected from gender, and how gender dysphoria differs from transitioning?
Yeah, so up until the early 70s, the terms sex and gender were used more or less as synonyms, to identify whether, or to describe whether you're male or female. After the 70s, and I'll save you the kind of long backstory of why certain academics and psychologists thought it was good to separate these terms. Leaders in the kind of sexology studies or whatever, psychology, they began to distinguish between sex and gender. So sex meaning biological sex, and gender has become a term that captures the psychological or sociological aspects of being male or female. And so sometimes gender is kind of a you can think in terms of like masculinity and femininity. Like, if you're male, you're male, okay? But are all males masculine? Well, that's a kind of different question. And the whole concept of masculinity depends on certain cultural assumptions, expectations, and then you also, within the category of gender, you have this subset called gender identity, and then that's where a lot of the discussion is focused on right now, is with gender identity. What is it? And what's the relationship between gender identity and biological sex? So gender identity is often defined as one's internal sense of self as male, female, both, or neither. So it's some people even say it's your internal feeling of of who you are, so there is a lot of, to be frank, there's a lot of subjectivity, and I think just sometimes confusion over what gender identity even is. But some people who are factually male might not resonate with that biological state. Now, the question is, if they don't resonate with it, if they experience some kind of incongruence between their gender identity and their biological sex, then which one, if I can say, like, wins out? Which one are they? So if you have a biological male whose gender identity, whose internal sense of who they are is not male, then does that mean they are not male because their internal sense doesn't resonate with that? Or does their biology trump their gender identity? And I mean, in my book Embodied, that's kind of the leading question that I focus on for the whole book, is wrestling with that question of incongruence. Which one are they? So yeah, we can get into that, but I'm just gonna let that sit, Rohan. So let my audience just kind of reflect on that.
In your book, you mention rapid onset gender dysphoria. Can you take us through how it's experienced by young people and the complexities surrounding its prognosis?
Sure. Yeah. Well, let me first. Yeah, I forgot to describe gender dysphoria in the last question. So, gender dysphoria is the newer psychological term used to describe the distress that some people feel between or as a result of this incongruence they might feel between their gender identity and biological sex. It used to be called gender identity disorder, but in 2013 they changed it from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. Rapid onset gender dysphoria describes this kind of newer unique phenomenon of teenagers coming out or coming down with experiencing gender dysphoria kind of like out of nowhere. Like the classic scenario is, a child comes home from school and kind of announces to their parents that they are trans or non-binary and they want to be called by they them pronouns, and maybe they have a new name they want to be called by. The parents are kind of just blown away because they're like, where did this come from? You didn't have any kind of cross-sex behavioral tendencies growing up. There was no evidence that you had gender dysphoria as a kid. It seems to have come out of nowhere. And then they start looking around at their social environment, and the question is often raised: is there something in their social environment that has played some influential role in their gender dysphoria or their gender identity? And there's been a massive increase in teenagers, especially teenage females, with this kind of scenario, this rapid onset gender dysphoria kind of coming out of nowhere, in almost every single Western country, including Australia. That's raised a lot of questions about the social influence that might be playing some kind of role here.
What would you want to highlight as the chief blind spots in how people talk about and deal with transgenderism in the church?
Chief blind spots. Wow. There's a few. And I don't say that lightly. I think, it's a complex conversation. And so, I don't fault anybody for kind of looking around and saying, what in the world is going on? I don't understand half these terms. I don't understand what's going on. Like it is a complex conversation. I think chief blind spots, if I could name a few, one would be trying to understand the trans conversation apart from getting to know trans people. And so when Christians simply look at clickbaity news headlines, about trans women in, biological males. That's a trans woman is a biological male who identifies as a woman. Trans women, wanting to play in female sports, or what else? There's a big issue, at least in the States and in the UK, of trans women, and again biological males in prison, who are saying, why I identify as a woman, so I want to be transferred to a female only prison. And so this raises lots of questions, and it raises a lot of like blood pressure really with people. They're like, man, this just doesn't seem right, and what's going on? And these are real issues. These are live issues. But if Christians only pay attention to clickbaity, sensational headlines and think that represents the totality of the trans conversation, I think they're going to be very much misled. Most trans people are not these kind of activist types who are trying to change bathroom policies or trying to push their way into female sports. Again, I'm not denying that that's not a real thing that's happening and isn't something we should think about. But most trans people are simply wrestling with who they are. And I think as Christians, we need to lead with compassion and try to understand the diversity of trans experiences before or without, just simply getting furious at the latest headline. So that would be a blind spot, I think. Don't pay as much attention to news headlines as you do to actual people. Also, I think there's a lot of intellectual and conceptual complexity with this conversation. So if kind of going back to my question, if somebody doesn't resonate with their biological sex, like, what do we do with that? And if Christians just simply say, well, that is who they are, and, get over it or whatever, like, well, I think that kind of fails to understand maybe some of the complexity of gender dysphoria, or even like, the argument has been made. I'll just say up front that I don't agree with the argument. But the argument has been made. Well, what if somebody is born with a male body and a female brain? Like, if you were to take my brain and stick it into if you were to take my brain and my wife's brain and swap them, so my brain exists in my wife's body, is that person me, or is it my wife? Is it the brain that is more important for personal identity, or is the body, And that's a fascinating conversation, right? I mean, that's a complex conversation. Well, this relationship between the body and brain, which can be pretty complex, is right at the heart of the trans conversation. Now again, I don't think people can be born with the brain of the opposite sex. I think there's problems both scientifically and theologically with that. But yeah, at least it's something that we need to be aware of and wrestle with. And we shouldn't assume that every person trying to argue for a trans identity is just kind of like ignoring science or biology or something. Like, I would fully agree. Some are making outrageous claims that don't resonate with the Bible or even basic science about human biology. But some people have really taken the time to think through this and are trying to understand the trans experience, because it can be super complex,
In your book, you relay a story about speaking to a university audience with a sense of dread, how you as a non-trans straight white guy can meaningfully speak into their experiences. How can public Christianity be missional in our time in a way that resists dishonoring the integrity of our anthropology, namely that humans are not merely constituted and defined by identity categories of gender, sexuality, and race?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love even the way you worded that. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the heart of our approach, right? We need to be filled with both grace and truth. And I don't know, I've been in this conversation for a while, and I've come to realize that no matter how gracious and loving and humble and kind you are, there's gonna be some people that are just gonna despise what Christianity stands for. And that's just the way it is. And I think we need to not I think we need to be okay with that. Okay. Our job is to embody the radical grace of Jesus, to be humble, to love people, to give up of ourselves for others. Our job is also to believe and embrace and follow what God has revealed to us about sin and human nature and himself and what it means to follow Jesus. And we need to not be ashamed. We need to not be ashamed of what we believe. We need to be courageous. And, I know in some circles today, it's controversial to say that sex is a binary, that God created humanity as male and female. And yes, there are certain people with what's called an intersex condition where they might have some atypical feature in their sexual anatomy. But male and female are still the only two sex categories. Sex is binary. And that's, we need to be okay with saying, yeah, I believe that. It's not only basic to the scriptures, it's also basic science. And I'm not going to be ashamed of embracing what I think is a very thoughtful, logical position. But that's the thing, though. We need to be, I think we need to be absolutely very thoughtful with what we believe. We need to know not just what we believe, but why we believe it. We need to listen to other viewpoints and see what they're actually saying, so that if we end up disagreeing with other viewpoints, we have not made a straw man just to knock it down. We have actually understood what that other viewpoint is and humbly reflected on what we think about that. And if we disagree, then provide more thoughtful evidence against that position, but do so in a spirit of humility and love. I mean, we must honor the humanity of other people, even when, or especially when, we are disagreeing with certain viewpoints that we hold. So if we do that in love, in humility, if we're truly trying to seek to understand other people, to be kind, and yet if we still say things that are true to God's word, but people find offensive, then that's the way it is. We need to tell the truth. We got to be truth tellers. We can't be ashamed of the truth in an age that I think, sometimes people are scared to do that.
In religious schools, there have been challenges around how best to care for students experiencing gender dysphoria. Could you offer some wisdom about how schools can do so in a way that's conducive to what is often an orthodox sexual ethic?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be super upfront and honest, I'm not a psychologist. Okay. I've done a lot of reading and study in psychology and in gender dysphoria, but I don't want people to, I want to encourage people to fact check everything I say, especially when I wander into areas that are not my primary area of expertise. But gender dysphoria is really complex. That's one thing that every psychologist is going to recognize, that we are still at the beginning stages of really understanding it, and we have a long way to go. It's gender dysphoria. It exists on a spectrum. I guess that's the first thing to note. Like, sometimes people experience it in a very mild way. Other people experience it in a very severe way, and it can be utterly debilitating. I mean, some people tell me, like, it's hard to even walk outside of my bedroom or go outside of my house without feeling crippling anxiety with this psychological condition that I didn't choose for myself. For other people, it's a little more milder. For some people, it might be connected to some past trauma they've experienced, or some women that experience gender dysphoria will later say that they had a kind of a warped view of what it means to be a woman. They would say they have this kind of, they would say, like, internalized misogyny that maybe that was pounded into them through a father figure or a family member or a parent or whatever. But for whatever reason, they felt really ashamed of simply being a woman, or they felt like being a woman meant you're weak and you're lesser than, and so sometimes that might feed into this distress that they feel when they look at their female body. So, I mean, I think we all agree that if that's the case, and that has been the case of some people's stories, then that's, there's deeper things that might need to be addressed. So all that to say, if you're, working with a teenager today, especially today in our complex culture, and they are experiencing gender dysphoria, or say they're experiencing gender dysphoria, then, I mean, I'm going to encourage everybody to just really get to know the person, get to know their story, do a lot of listening, try to understand what's going on, and see if maybe there's other things that might need to be dealt with that might be intertwined with that gender dysphoria, because it's unprecedented how many teenagers especially are coming out as experiencing gender dysphoria. And so I do think that pastors and Christian leaders and parents, we need to be really aware and alert to that, because there's a very good chance we're going to come across somebody, maybe one of our own kids, who will experience gender dysphoria.
The recent Tavistock court case in the United Kingdom has brought attention to a movement known as the detransitioners, people that feel that they were too hastily pushed into transitioning. Can you provide your view on the importance of that decision and what we can learn from this detransitioner movement?
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. There's I think it's called the Detransition Advocacy Network, I think, but there's actually several organizations popping up. The Peak Resilience Project is another one, and there's there's several. You can Google around, and there's several organizations that are filled with people who once identified as trans were, they would say, quickly encouraged by their either parents or medical caretakers to transition. and then later on realize that was a bad decision. But guess what? They may have made irreversible steps towards transitioning that are there for life. If somebody takes cross-sex hormones, for instance, like high doses of hormones that are produced at much higher rate among the opposite sex, so biological female taking testosterone, a biological male taking estrogen, it's been shown that if you do that for 1 or 2 or 3 years, there's a good chance you're going to be infertile for the rest of your life. And most 15-year-old girls I know aren't necessarily thrilled at having a baby. Like, they get kind of creeped out, or like, oh my gosh, I can't believe, no, I don't want that. But when they're 25, they might. But that decision has been taken away from them by somebody who said, oh, if you're trans, then you must transition. Here's the pills. Here's what you need to do. And there is in the last couple of years, especially, a rapidly growing number of young, like 20 something, especially females, coming out, and they're pretty upset at how people out of ideological commitments really encourage them to transition. And they look back and say, I was a confused teenager. I was dealing with all kinds of other mental health stuff that you guys didn't even really ask me about. And you guys rushed me to transition. And now I'm left with the irreversible lifelong effects. And you mentioned a court case. Kiara Bell is one of these young 20-something females who this happened to. And she ended up raising a lawsuit against the high court in the UK and won. And so now the medical caretakers in the UK are really starting to revisit how to best care for trans-identified teenagers, because they're recognizing that, again, trans is a very broad, sometimes nebulous category, and teenagers are teenagers. Like, identities come and go, and internal senses of self come and go. That's the definition of gender identity, one's internal sense of who you are. Well, if we're going to ask any parent out there who has a teenager, if we ask the question, your teenager's internal sense of who they are, is that stable or static? Is that etched in stone, or does it kind of come and go? Every parent's going to roll their eyes and say, my teenager's all over the map on these things. And for some reason, when it comes to the trans conversation, we think the second they announce that they're trans, it's like to question that, or even think like that's anything but a stable, concrete, identity is seen as transphobic and a hate monger and all this stuff. And so all that to say, yeah, I think we're going to see, honestly, I honestly believe we're going to see more and more lawsuits of younger people coming out later and detransitioning, and really raising some legitimate concerns over how they were cared for. Again, it's happening in the UK, it's happening in Sweden, it's happening in other European countries. Unfortunately, Canada and the US, we're a little behind the times. We're still living in this kind of progressive utopian kind of way of approaching it, but more and more medical professionals are starting to speak out, at great risk. And there's a lot of actual feminists in Australia who are kind of leading the way in this, especially in Melbourne and other places that are kind of starting to speak out. People who aren't even like religious, who are saying, look, I have no problem morally with an adult transitioning, but I have a huge problem with medical caretakers encouraging a 15-year-old confused teenager with other mental health issues, encouraging them to transition. I think that's really problematic. So we will see. Honestly, I don't, in the next couple of years, it'll be interesting to see where some of these countries are at with this question.
In Canada, a father has recently been jailed for refusing to call his daughter anything but a girl and criticizing her being prescribed puberty blockers. In your book, you talk about Christians enraged by the world gone mad and over-conceptualizing their approach to faith. How would you seek to temper that rage when people look to these examples and fear for the hearts and minds of their own children?
Oh, it's such a good question. You're filled with great questions. Man, I'm really trying to navigate that tension. The tension being looking at legitimate, heart-wrenching, disturbing things going on, like what you just described. That can you imagine where we are in society, that a father who calls his daughter a daughter is seen as toxic, and you no longer, as a parent, have the rights. The government's going to take the right away for you to parent your child because you are simply acknowledging one of the most basic facts about their existence, that they are either male or female. That's it's our audience might know the book 1984 by George Orwell. I actually read that book recently, and it was eerie. Like, some of the stuff that he's talking about there is almost, that's like far-fetched, kind of out there. Society is like, a lot of that seems to be kind of happening now, maybe on a lesser level, maybe beginning stages, but we're starting to redefine some basic terms like, man and woman. If you were to walk into a public school and say, how would you define the term boy and girl? You might have a huge debate, and that's like crazy. Like, if you were to learn English as a second language, boy, girl, man, woman is probably one of the first 10 words you're going to learn, because these are just some of those basic terms of humanity. And again, it's pretty basic science to say that Homo sapiens as a species, we are sexually dimorphic. Like, that's in every science book. Like, any doctor that's operating on you in hospital, you would want to make sure that they believe that real basic fact about humanity. We can determine the sex of a human 100 years after they've been dead. I mean, these are things that are just etched into the fabric of our humanity. But the categories of boy, girl, man, woman now are, people assume very different understandings of what that means. So, we are. So all that to bring it back to your question, I think I want to acknowledge that there is much that we could be enraged about. And I do think that we should be equipped to understand and respond with responsibly to really bad, dangerous views of human nature. Like, we need to be able to deconstruct destructive views of human nature. But simply being enraged over our current cultural moment is not going to bring people to Christ. It's not going to manifest the full presence of Jesus. Like, we need to respond with intellectual credibility, with truthfulness, with forthrightness, but we also need to do so with love and humility. I had a friend of mine who identifies as trans, and I asked my friend, I said, okay, look, I want to ask you just a really honest question. Like, people, like, biological sex is a reality. Like, humans are male or female. Again, I'm always going to acknowledge that there's a small percentage of people with an intersex condition where there might be a blend of male and female, but male and female are still the only sex categories for humanity. So I told my friend, I'm like, look, how do I get around the fact that 99.99% of people are clearly male or female? Is it okay to remind, a trans person of that if they're kind of like in denial of that, which again, not everyone is. Okay. And that's something we need to understand. Not every trans person is a biology denier. But for those who might say, no, I don't feel like a man, so I'm not a man, but you are a man, like you are a male, like that's just a fact. And my friend, I really appreciate this response from my trans friend. They said, yes, biology is a reality. Yes, 99.99% of people are male or female. For some reason, it's hard to describe. Some of us really, really, really struggle with that. If you are committed to walking with me in relationship, then yeah, I want to hear what you had to say. But if you're just lobbing some argument from the other side of the fence and you have no desire to enter into a committed relationship with me, then I don't want to hear your biological lecture. Yes, I know, I get it, but I am sitting in my house wanting to kill myself because I feel like I'm walking around in somebody else's body and I don't know what to do with that. are you willing to sit with me and walk with me and be with me when I need a friend? So I think it is a both and. I think Christians need to be able to think through it, critically think through and respond to with thoughtfulness and truth and grace to certain things going on in society, certain beliefs that are being promoted that are outrageous. We do need to address those and respond. But we also need to be committed to walking with actual trans people, because we want all people to come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Like, that is our primary mission, is not to deconstruct the latest cultural, thing that's being promoted. Our mission is to embody the radical grace and truth of Jesus to further God's kingdom on earth. And to do that, we need to have both grace and truth.
In the USA, the forthcoming Equality Act has received much criticism for the absence of religious freedom protections. When talking with concerned people, how have you maintained the posture of interpersonal kindness while expressing disfavor at the effects of the Act on religious institutions in public life?
Man, yeah, that's so my main area is not like politics or even governmental things. It is, my main focus is on the ethics of the church. But yeah, certainly I'm well aware of the Equality Act and how to go about a conversation. Again, I don't want to simply enrage an already enraged group of Christians, and I see people do that. Like, they know that this is going to upset Christians, and so they know Christians are upset, and so they start preaching against it. Can you believe this? We need to fight all this. And you just kind of enraged an already enraged group of people. And again, I'm not going to deny that there are things about, for instance, the Equality Act that you read and you're like, are you kidding me? But we simply being enraged over it is not going to lead people to Jesus. It's not going to manifest the grace and truth of Christ. So again, let's truly understand what is being said. Like, I would wonder how many Christians have actually read the details of the Equality Act and not just their favorite news outlet that is kind of either celebrated it or gotten angry over it. Like, let's look past the headlines. Let's actually take time to understand what is going on. So, I think, how do we respond? I think it's always good. Like, is there anything in this thing that we have problems with that we can affirm? Because if you affirm, certain things in your quote unquote opponent or something they're opposing or not, not on board with, I think that can show that you are actually trying to consider it. You're trying to see it from their perspective. You're trying to build some common ground. So yeah, do I think that trans people should be mistreated or not be given mortgages or whatever? Well, no. I think equality is something that is fundamental to a democratic society. Like, I think that's a good thing. Now, do I think the Equality Act is simply wanting trans people to be treated fairly? I don't think so. I think there's a lot of ideological, like really dangerous ideological assumptions that go into it. And the way that the Equality Act even defines something as basic as even biological sex. Like, I'm not even talking about gender yet, but their definition of biological sex is the most bizarre, unscientific. Some of the most liberal people on earth don't even agree with how they're defining biological sex. And so I think looking at some of the fundamental components of the Equality Act and interacting with that rather than just simply getting enraged at the kind of results of it. But yeah, I think from what I've seen, and again, there's other people who are more of an expert who have really researched the Equality Act and really taken time to dive in. But from the little I've looked at it, I do think it's very problematic for religious freedom. But that's something that we in the church in America we're kind of, well, some of us, we're kind of anticipating that we're going to feel more of a squeeze on our religious freedom. Okay. And I want to encourage the church. I'm like, our faith is in Jesus, not in religious freedom. Like, many Christians around the globe historically have flourished when they had little to no religious freedom. And so we're justified by faith. We're not justified by religious freedom. So from a political standpoint, I think religious freedom is a huge value. I think it's super important. But if that is taken away, and it might be taken away, okay, take it away. What do we still have a mission. That doesn't change our mission as kingdom of God warriors, to fight not some culture war, but to fight against the spiritual forces of this present evil age that are not of flesh and blood, to press on and further God's kingdom. I also think that, I don't think it's helpful for society to define to define humans based on gender identity. And the classic example, of course, the kind of low hanging fruit, as we say, is in athletics. There are clear, basic biological differences between men and women. And once we start defining humanity based on gender identity, your internal sense of who they are, which is super subjective and flexible. I don't think that's good for society. I'll just say that. I think, I'm not even saying because I'm a Christian, of course I have biblical problems with that, but just scientifically, I think it is denying some basic facts about biology, and I think it will ultimately hurt women. So I like to say to my progressive friends, I'm too much of a feminist to to be fully on board with the Equality Act, while acknowledging, there's certain things that it says that, I think that's a good thing. I think it would be wrong for a trans person to try to get an apartment and they get denied, and then a non-trans person, gets the apartment or whatever. I don't think those types of things are healthy for a democratic society either. So that's the extent of my knowledge on the Equality Act. There's not a whole lot more I could say there without getting into, getting over my skis, as we say.
One of the vexed ways in which the public discussion manifests on LGBT issues is the connection between religious doctrine and teen suicide. In your book, you mention the notion of transition or suicide. How would you offer wisdom on how to navigate that? And why do you think it hurts discourse and a pursuit of the facts?
Yeah, that's a great question. That I wrote a whole appendix in the book on this question. And honestly, I was really nervous about writing that because suicide obviously is a super sensitive and vulnerable thing. And I've had close friends of mine, close people in my life, either wrestle with suicidality or commit suicide. Other people who were about to commit suicide and didn't do it, and so it's this isn't an abstract question for me. So I want to wrestle with it with the utmost pastoral sensitivity. And yet suicide as well, suicidality in the trans conversation has been, if I could say, weaponized by some people. And that's equally troubling to me, to use something as sensitive and vulnerable as suicide as some kind of cog in your, ideological argument. I think that is incredibly dehumanizing. And it would make me wonder whether you actually care about suicidality and people who are suicidal if you're just simply using it as an argument, like the saying that I have in my book. You'll hear this quite often from people, some medical professionals, to parents that are reluctant to have their teenage trans-identified kid transition, and so the saying often goes, well, do you want an alive son or a dead daughter? As if those are the only two options. That is medically and psychologically irresponsible to say that to a parent. What parent's going to say, no, I want a dead daughter? Well, of course not. But they've been told the only other option is to transition their son. In the face of scientific evidence, in the face of all kinds of studies, that is simply not true. It's not as if transitioning your 15-year-old girl is going to therefore take away their suicidal tendencies. Loads of studies have been done that have been shown that transitioning, especially teens who might fit the rapid onset gender dysphoria kind of category. I know we talked about that earlier. There's no evidence that simply transitioning them will take that away. The one thing that I did point out in that appendix is, we hear about high rates of suicide among the trans population, we often hear there's a famous statistic: 41% of trans people attempt suicide. And to be precise, there is one study that came up with that statistic, that 41% of adults. The study was people over 18. It was not of teenagers or kids. Okay, so if people take that percentage and say, well, my 15-year-old's gonna, well, wait, that study is based on adults, not teens. And it does go down when you're dealing with teens and suicidality. But that's one study. There's been many studies done on it. I mean, percentages range all over the place. In fact, the same organization that came up with the 41% did the same study a couple years later and came up with something like 22 or 23% of trans people commit suicide. And so that's when I get a little unimpressed when people simply reach for the highest percentage, then put it into their argument and say, if you don't transition, half of these kids are going to end up, committing suicide. And it's like, well, you're abusing that statistic. And that's really sad for the people that are actually part of that statistic. So the one thing we know from experts in suicidality is that almost every person who attempts or commits suicide has a mental health issue that is not being addressed. Suicide.org is a famous website devoted to this conversation, to suicidality in general. And they say, I think it was 95 or 96% of people who commit suicide had an undiagnosed or unaddressed mental health issue. We also have seen that, and this is something I discussed in the book, that there was one study that was done that I think the percentage they came up with was something like low 30s, like maybe 33% of trans people have attempted or thought about suicide. But then it's called control, like they had a control study. Like they then measured, what about non-trans people with mental health issues? That what percentage are they that attempt suicide? And it was the same percentage. And so they suggested, and several psychologists have pointed this out, I don't know why it's not more widely known. It's not that simply being trans is going to lead to suicidality. And it's not just that they are not socially accepted. That might play some role. It is often the case that they're wrestling with some other kind of mental health issue that is not being addressed. And so this is where I get really concerned, is in some medical circles to even raise a question about mental health. And what about, somebody comes out as trans and you say, well, is there any kind of past trauma? Is there any kind of, if you start exploring other psychological things they might be wrestling with, you're seen as transphobic, or you're seen as trying to correct them or advocating for reparative therapy. If you try to explore, what's causing this? Because some people will say, well, nothing's caused, they're just trans. Can't you honor the beautiful diversity of people? Some people are trans and there's nothing wrong with them. It's like, well, I that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that statistically, trans identified people have a much, much higher rate of other co-occurring mental health issues. And if we simply ignore that, then how can we say we actually care about their possible suicidality when we know from every expert in suicidality that it's often the result of a mental health, unaddressed mental health issue. So suicidality among the trans community is high. That's disturbing. It should disturb any Christian. But the question is, what is causing it and how do we address it? Simply saying, well, we need to affirm their identity and transition them and not question anything. I don't think that's the answer. I think that it's way more deeper and complex than that. If by affirm we mean we need to love them, affirm them as created in God's image, say they are beautiful before God and delighted in by God, and I love you and God loves you and I want to walk with you. Yeah, if that's what you mean by affirm, then sure. Absolutely. That's the call of every Christian. But if by affirm people mean unless this biological female who believes they're male, unless you agree with that, then they're going to attempt suicide. That's not the answer. That's not, that's not, that I think that's a superficial, very thin, misleading view of affirmation. So, super complex conversation, man. And we do have to enter into it really lightly, again and again, embodying both the grace and truth of Jesus.
The book is Embodied, Transgender Identities, the Church, and what the Bible has to say. And it's available for purchase now. Dr. Sprinkle, thank you very much indeed for speaking with us today on Talking Freely.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
That's it for our latest episode of Talking Freely. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so through our website, www.freedomforfaith.org.au. Freedom for Faith exists through the generous donations of individuals and organisations across Australia. If you'd like to financially partner with us, you can do so through our website.